I'm Janet Jacobson, and I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is simultaneously our annual Women's History Month lecture, and also the first inaugural Natalie Boymel Kampen Lecture in Criticism and History. As part of the transition at BCRW, we held a retreat with our advisory board in the fall. And at that retreat, there was a desire to honor our colleague, Natalie Kampen, who, as you know, was a longtime director and then chair of the Women's Studies Program and Department here at Barnard College, and was also the Barbara Novak chair in art history, and who was a force to be reckoned with. Now, you know, Tally, as she was known here, truly was a kick-ass person. And she led not only women's studies here on campus and more generally, she was a scholar and a feminist, but she provided, I think, a sense of moral compass and intellectual leadership to our campus as a whole. She was an internationally known scholar. Just to name a few of her honors, she was a research fellow at Oxford University. She received the Felix Neuberg Medal at the University of Gothenburg. She was a visiting professor of art history at Nehru University in New Delhi. She was a visiting professor of Roman art and architecture at the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology and the Ancient World at Brown University, and she was co-administrator of a Getty Foundation grant sponsoring international study of art and architecture in the Roman provinces. She was the author of many books, including Image and Status, Roman Working Women in Ostia, and Family Fictions in Roman Art. She was the editor of another book, Sexuality in Ancient Art, and the author of numerous articles and chapters in scholarly journals, encyclopedias, and books, including Art Journal, the American Journal of Archaeology, Art Bulletin, The Art of Citizens, Soldiers, and Freedmen in the Roman World, was another book that she edited in 2006. We were very honored to have Tally as our colleague. We were very sorry when she died, many of us feel before her time, and we are very, very proud to be able to honor her with this ongoing lectureship here at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Were it not for Tally, I probably would never have become director, and I certainly would never have been able to do the job that I have been able to do over these past 15 years. So I would like us to, this evening, think of Tally and think of the honor that we are able to provide for her in providing the first annual, with many to follow, lecture in criticism and history. Now, yes. For many years, this lecture has been known as the Women's History Month Lecture. When I first came to Barnard, there was a large advisory board made up of both of members of the Barnard community, faculty, staff, some alumni, and Professor Sloan and I were discussing beforehand, and many of you may know the answer to this. We're not sure exactly when it was established, but he's going to check the documentary record. But certainly for much longer than I have been director, and probably by my predecessor, Leslie Kalman. And over that time, many people have served on that board throughout the time that I've been here, and some of them throughout the time of the center. I see my colleagues Sue Sachs and Flora Sheminovitz, for example, who have been involved in BCRW forever. And so at my first advisory board meeting, we were discussing the programming for the upcoming year, and we were talking about Women's History Month, which, as you know, is celebrated every year in March, the month that we are still in, which some of you associate with springtime, mistakenly. And at that moment, my memory is that Professor Sloan hit the table for emphasis. This may not be true, but it is my memory. And said, why in March, in Women's History Month, should we have a lecture just on women when we could have a lecture on history? And he was backed up by some powerful members of the board. Rosalind Rosenberg was also on the board at that time. Probably Elizabeth Costelli may have jumped in at this moment. I'm not exactly sure. But I have to admit, I had no good argument as to why we should not have a history lecture in the month of March. And so we instituted a Women's History Month lecture, and it has been one of the best lectures that we've had. Last year, it was offered by Joan Scott from the Institute for Advanced Study. We've had the honor of having Afsana Najmabadi, who is our former colleague who is now at Harvard. Dorothy Coe gave a lecture before she joined our faculty. And so we have been very, very proud to have a lecture on history every year in the month of March, and we're very proud that it will now continue under the auspices of Tally's name and of the broad fields of criticism and history. And I am particularly honored to have managed in my first year here to recognize that I should do something that Herb Sloan suggested at the advisory board meeting. As many of you know, Professor Sloan is retiring at the end of this year, and to me, it is a great loss. He has been one of the most faithful members of the BCRW Advisory Board, and he claims that this is simply easy service, and he comes to the meetings and does nothing more than share his ideas. But I have to say that his ideas are good ones, and that I would be impoverished were he not to share them with me. These include not only having the annual Women's History Month lecture, but in fact, I believe in that first year he also suggested that we should invite Annette Gordon-Reed to lecture here at Barnard College, so I'm glad that that has finally come to pass. And I just want to take a moment to say a personal note about Professor Sloan. He is to me also a model of someone who is willing to make principled arguments in all the fora of the university. And as I said to Professor Gordon-Reed coming over here, he's willing to argue against the administration, he's willing to argue against me, he's willing to say what he thinks. And I wish that we had more people here at the university who were willing to stand up and speak their mind and sometimes hit the table for emphasis. So I am very glad that we were able to bring Professor Gordon-Reed here in this special Women's History Month lecture, and especially to honor Professor Sloan. So without further ado, Herbert Sloan will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Janet, for that generous introduction and reminding me of my habit of pounding the table, which I will now be a little bit more sensitive about. So this evening, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our inaugural Natalie Boymel Kampen lecturer. My old friend, sometimes partner in crime, and fellow Facebooker, Annette Gordon-Reed. And indeed, we were exchanging notes on something this morning, so that actually is one of her more distinguished characteristics. Professor Gordon-Reed is a member of the faculty of the Harvard Law School, where she is the Charles Warren Professor of Legal History. She's also a member of the Harvard History Department and is the Carl Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. This year, she adds another title to that already distinguished list. She's the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford. And for those of you who don't know about the Harmsworth Professorship, it's probably the most distinguished position an American historian can occupy. Every year, a leading American historian is selected to go to Oxford and teach for that year. And this is Annette's year at Oxford, where she is holding down the fort and by all accounts accomplishing wonderful things. She did her undergraduate work at Dartmouth and then went on to earn a JD at the Harvard Law School. Her earlier career was one that one might expect from a graduate of the Harvard Law School. Work in a prestigious Manhattan law firm, then government service, then a career teaching law at New York Law School. But it is safe to say, I think, that the law in and of itself was not enough to satisfy her, to occupy her intellectual energies fully. And so she drifted, and that's not quite the word I want, but I'm always searching for the exact word, so you'll forgive me if drifted doesn't seem to indicate much sense of purpose and so on, because that's not exactly what I want to convey. So she drifted at any rate, and we all have to thank her for this, in the direction of history, and particularly in the direction of that man some of us know best as meal ticket. And for those of you who don't know that, that actually is what we refer to him as in the business. Otherwise, he's known to the rest of you as Thomas Jefferson. Okay. In 1997, when Professor Gordon-Reed published Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, the book that first brought her to the attention of historians, and not just historians, I should add, it was pretty much accepted in historical circles that the stories of a liaison between Sally Hemings and her master were just that, stories. There were a good many reasons for this, but the one that I want to point to is the basic fact of historians' laziness. It was because historians weren't willing to do the work that Annette Gordon-Reed did that this story, this legend that there was no relationship between Jefferson and Hemings, persisted as long as it did. But she was willing to take the effort to re-examine the evidence. And it was the evidence that other people had sort of mindlessly cited again and again without thinking about it in any particular way. Oh, that's what you use to make this point. She looked at this evidence with a sort of careful eye, a legal eye, I think would be safe to say, and she sifted it and she re-examined it, and at the end of her efforts, she came to the conclusion that it wasn't the case that there had been no relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings. On the contrary, it was all too evident that there had been. This was a shock to many historians who had grown up thinking, oh, I can dismiss those stories, they don't really matter. And it made a big difference, not only to Jefferson studies, but to larger issues in the historical profession as well, I think. And I want to add that all of this was before the DNA evidence about which some of you may know. It was before the DNA evidence entered the picture. So Annette did this simply on the basis of her careful examination of the documentary evidence and how her ability to see how that evidence should be read. She didn't have, chromosomes, she didn't have any of that stuff. And at least for some people, it was obvious that she had nailed the case, that DNA evidence or no DNA evidence, the answer was now clear to any questions you might have, or at least to many of the questions you might have about Jefferson and Hemings. It's true that there are still some naysayers, but their number is small and their importance is nil. Yes, I won't go into that. You can find it on the web if you actually look. So Annette Gordon-Reed is one of those people who changed the way we think about a particular episode and about a particular individual of some importance. And nowadays, this seems like, oh yeah, we all know that. But believe me, when I was a graduate student, nobody knew this. And for those of us who saw this happening, it was an amazing performance, a real intellectual tour de force on Annette Gordon-Reed's part. And it's still, her books are worth reading, obviously, but it's worth going back to that first book to see just how skillfully she accomplished this mission, the real elegance with which her demonstration was shaped. Okay, in 2008, we got the publication of a second book on the Hemingses called The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, the first in what she promises will be a 2-volume work on this extraordinary group of people, not just Sally Hemings, but her progenitors and her descendants as well. The book won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, and what Wikipedia informs me were 15 other awards, which I will spare us, not because they're not worth listing, but because they're a lot. Right? In turn, this led to her receipt in 2010 of a National Humanities Award and a MacArthur Fellowship, some of the most distinguished honors that could be given to an American historian. There's a good deal more that could be said about Professor Gordon-Reed's achievements, but I think you're here this evening to listen to her and not to me. So without more ado, I give you Professor Gordon-Reed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Herb. It's wonderful to be able to be back here at Barnard, because I've actually been here before, once before, not long after my first book came out, and I think it was at Herb's invitation. And so it's good to be back here after all of this has happened, all the things, a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and in a very, very good way, I have to say, considering where things started out when I had it in my mind that I wanted to write about this topic about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, not to prove that the story was true, but to really express my sense of an injustice that had been done to enslaved African Americans who told a story about their family, and the story was not believed. And it just struck me as strange that people who were the objects of oppression, who were the objects of slavery, who felt it most intensely, were not listened to when they came outside of slavery and said, this is what happened. And it struck me as strange, too, as a law professor, that historians typically resorted to law, to legal language when they spoke about this. They would say, if this were in a court of law, this would happen. If you have, using the terms burden of proof and witnesses and things like that to try to invoke the seriousness of their discussion, stepping outside of history, but as I said, using the terms of law to make these points. And of course, as a law professor, looking at them and looking at the evidence that I knew was there, it seemed that they were misusing understandings about law to make their point. And I sort of thought, well, if you want to play that game, if this were a legal issue, let's play it, because I can play it, and I can do that. And I can do it not in terms of a courtroom, even though the publicity that UVA press did, they actually hired a publicist. This is an academic press. They don't typically do that, but they had a sense that this might be a crossover book. So they actually hired a publicist, and the publicist had this billed as Annette Gordon-Reed puts Jefferson on trial. And that really wasn't what I had in mind. I'm not a trial lawyer. You mentioned that I do what somebody who graduates from Harvard and goes to a prestigious law firm. Well, what that consists of in the first few years is being pretty much a drone. You know, you're there, running around doing research and things like that. You're not in trial, but I'm a lawyer, and so that's what people think of. What I had in mind more was what it's like when I talk to my students, what law professors do with students, and that is to walk them through the case, walk them through competing stories about what happened in the past. Law is about stories, and law is about narratives, and the people who can tell their story most effectively are the people who win the case. And so it's definitely fits what historians do, and when they tell stories of people's lives, it sort of dovetails nicely with what law professors and lawyers try to do when we talk to our students to get them to unpack the differing stories. Now, when I wrote the first book, I mentioned law, but I talked mainly about law in terms of evidence, in terms of witnesses, in things that you could consider either criminal law or criminal procedure, those areas of laws, those terms that historians had borrowed to make their case that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings did not have children together. And I thought about the way black people's voices were not credited in the same way that white voices were credited in this sort of imaginary court of law that they had in place. But there was something that I did not think about until I started writing the Hemingses of Monticello. And it's strange, when you write a book, at the moment that it's done, you're happy that it's done, and I did every single thing that I could do, but if I look at that book now, I would do things a bit differently. My first book, what I would have emphasized more, and what I tried to do in the Hemingses of Monticello, is to talk about the way the law, not just law in terms of witnesses and evidence, but law as a shaper of reality, law as a shaper of the structures of reality, how that influences the way people see enslaved individuals, and how people saw the Hemings family, particularly family law. Family law tells us who we are. The law tells us who we are as a family, and we accept that. The presumption that a married couple, the children of a married couple, belong to the husband is a legal presumption. It's not a fact, and we know it's not a fact, but the law presumes that for the law's own reasons, because the law is interested in trying to find an efficient way to figure out who gets this guy's stuff when he dies, figure out who can be on the hook for the maintenance of a child, and figure out who has the right to the labor of a child, to a child's labor. And we're talking mainly in Jefferson's time and 19th century time, but it's basically the law has its own reasons for those presumptions, whether it's biologically true or not, unless it's changed by statute. The common law said that unless the man was, physically, in another country, or the man was impotent, even if have reason to believe that the man was not the father, the presumption is that it's the husband. And in some states, you have to change it by statute, even after DNA evidence shows it, that, the husband is still considered to be the father, because the law has its purposes that don't have anything to do with reality. It's about efficiency, the efficient operation of society. And of course, that helps people, that helps all of us. We have benefited from that in ways, and other people have been burdened, but there's a purpose for this, and I'm not speaking against it. But you can think about how that protects people during their lifetimes and how it protects people as the years go by. And what has happened with the Jefferson family and the Jefferson-Randolph family is that their legal marriages, their legal family, served as a protection against the encroachment of other people who are outside of that family. There's a presumption of their truth. There's a presumption that they, not only did they inherit the land, well, they didn't inherit the land because Jefferson died bankrupt, so they didn't get very much of anything, but if they did, if he had been more fortunate with his affairs, they would have inherited the property, and they would have had the right to speak about the land. They would have had control over those things. Well, the same thing went, I think, with their reputation, with their family, with their understanding of who their family was, and also what happened at Monticello. It's as if when they spoke, their words were real because they were real. The law had made them an entity, a family, that people should respect, and had the right to speak about what went on in their own homes. Now, it seems odd that you would trust families to be objective about themselves. Obviously, if somebody were to say, I think this was something that was peculiar to history and historians looking at Jefferson and his family and the people of those particular times, the founders, I would say, because I don't, if somebody said, well, we know the answer to what's going on in the Bush-Clinton, family or whatever, because, George Bush has written a memoir or Hillary Clinton has written a memoir. People would be skeptical. You'd say, I don't know that you can trust these people to tell them, because they're not objective, not just because you think they're necessarily liars, but they can't be objective. But for some reason, that didn't seem to key in with what was happening with historians who were looking at this topic. And in my first book, I zeroed in on race as a reason for this, for the sort of double standard, class as a reason for the double standard, but I would also add this issue of family and our understandings of family that are created by the law and how it protects the Jeffersons. And gives them the right, or gave them the right, to speak about what happened at Monticello. And if they said Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings did not have children, then the presumption should be that they did not have them, in much the same way you presume the husband is the father of all these kids, even though we know false paternities could be anywhere from 3 to 10%. It's simply not true that all husbands are the fathers of the children of the marriage. So there's one side, Thomas Jefferson and his wife Martha, even though we don't have any letters between them, people assume that we know what their marriage was like. We assume it because he talks about it occasionally. He talks about his grief upon her death. Other people talk about his grief upon her death, but we have nothing from Martha. We have no way of knowing how Martha felt about him, what she really felt about him, but she married him. And the fact that she married him gives, although she could have married him for all kinds of reasons, particularly during that time period, united property, all kinds of things. But we assume, or historians assume, that this is about love. And so the Jefferson marriage the blanks have been filled in with our understanding of what legal marriage means. So that gives Martha a protection as well. If I were to say, they had 5 children. I think she had 1 pregnancy that ended in miscarriage. If I were to suggest that it's possible that any of those children didn't belong to him, people would be outraged, because they have the cover of the marriage that protects them against any talk like that, even though we know nothing about this woman. And it's entirely possible that some of them were and some of them were not. But that cover keeps people away from that. And if you suggest, as I said, that it's possible, people would be offended and angry. So what does that mean for African American people, enslaved people, who don't have that cover? For Sally Hemings, Elizabeth Hemings, Mary Hemings, what it means is that people assume that, under the law, children born to unmarried people and enslaved people could not be legally married were filius nullius. It's the child of no one. Anybody could be. Anybody or no one, anybody, as if they dropped from the sky. They're the child of no one. And for times, people could not inherit from the mother. That was changed. But surely the presumption that you couldn't inherit from the father, of course, went far longer than that. So what do you do with people who can't have legal marriages and have children? It's like their family is nothing. But everybody is the child of someone. And we understand that there are ways for people in communities to know things that are not known or recognized in law. There's another reality that exists out there. There's the obvious biological reality that the person is there. They're present. They must have come from some other place. But what that means is that African American women under slavery, their families, their lives could be devalued. Their connections are devalued. And Sally Hemings can be given a new father of her children every 3 years. It could be anybody. Because they don't. There's no order there. There's nothing. You go from knowing everything about Tom and Martha, even though we know nothing about them really. We go from pretending that we know everything about them because of that legal marriage to knowing absolutely nothing. We can know absolutely nothing about Sally Hemings. It doesn't make any difference what people are saying. It doesn't make any difference what circumstances that you can hook to the things that people are saying. Nothing about the character of her life. Without that piece of paper, without that sense of law protecting you, her story, her family's story cannot be accepted. She doesn't get that particular cover, nor do her mother and her daughter, who ran off to live as a white woman and actually did get married, although we don't know to whom she was married. We know nothing about her life, about who she was, because she crossed over into whiteness, married a man, her children, and she could be protected under the cover of law. So I would have added that much more to the first book. I would have talked about it. It's strange that I didn't think of that. I was a property professor, am a property professor, that I didn't think about, not just think about it in terms of law, of evidence and witnesses, but thinking about family law and how that really was another reason that people didn't want to accept the story. And here I could have a bit of sympathy, maybe Herb, you're looking for the right word, drifting, sympathy, maybe the word empathy, whatever, with members of the Jefferson family who are still, some of whom are still not pleased about this particular story, is because we draw circles around our families. We think we know who they are. And if you step back for a second and think of how people would feel if, you might feel if somebody came and announced themselves to be a part of your family, even if you didn't, you'd pause. You'd say, what? This is not my understanding of who we are. But I think that that's operating with them as well. Now, if somebody came to me and said, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had a mistress, I'd say, oh, that's interesting. I don't think I would feel bad about that particularly, because the connection is too attenuated for me to get upset about it. I think the difference for the descendants of Jefferson's legal white family is that he is very present to them because of who he is. Because of his status, he might be like a grandfather would be to me. The sort of protectiveness I might have about a grandfather or a great-grandfather. I knew my great-grandmother. So, I would feel close to that person, and I might balk much more at an attempt for someone to put themselves into my family. And probably, you would stand, the first thing would be to stand on, well, who married whom? And who's connected to whom, and how do you fit into all of this? So it's a natural, I think race was important, I think class is important, but I also think the protections that law confer upon people who are in legalized marriages was also a part of it. That's how they were able to get away with. I think when you said people didn't think this through, I don't think they thought they had to, because it was easy to just say, well, filius nullius. Enslaved women, because they didn't have husbands, they were promiscuous. They could, there's nobody there to stop them in any way, nothing there to hold them back. And so they were suggesting another statement about the nature of African American women. One legal theorist, Thomas R.R. Cobb, talked about rape and how, rape was not possible. There was not possible because African American women, black women, Negro women, he said, always consented to sex. And so there could be no known instance of, now he knew better than that, right? But this is the kind of stuff that people like Jefferson very often did, or not often, but did on occasion, say things that aren't true, just as a part of the catechism of white supremacy, just to to put black people down. But that's the thinking, because you don't have if you're unmarried, people are not capable of chastity, and that comes from law. So how do you write about this when you're trying to I do the first book? I say, as Herb suggested, it's in all likelihood, Jefferson and Sally Hemings did have a relationship and did have a number of children. We can talk later on about what relationship means, because that's another difficult thing to parse here. And the story of the Woodsons, there's a family called the Woodsons who believe they're descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which I said in the book they were not. The DNA suggested that they were not. And the car story, for people who don't know, Jefferson's family said that the reason Sally Hemings' children looked just like Jefferson was that they were the children of his nephew. And, which is not crazy. I mean, cousins and people can look alike, but that was the very convenient story they told. The DNA ruled these people out. So Herb says, my book comes out, I think I'm up here before the DNA comes out. And actually, Herb was the person who gave me the DNA results. Because I had made these bold pronouncements, and then I found out during a lecture down in Charlottesville that they were going to be doing this test. And that was sort of an interesting year, I can tell you, waiting for this to come back. And I got this phone call from the Wall Street Journal, and I was cooking, and a person said, what would you say if I told you the DNA had come back? But it hasn't come back. But what if I told you if it had come back and it showed that it was a car. I said, well, I'd say this. Well, what if I told you that it was a Jefferson? Well, I'd say this. And then I hung up, and of course, the next day I realized that it had come back. Herb told me it had come back, and because they basically lied, told me that, because she was trying to do this without me going to tell anybody. And Herb told me, what the results were. So after that, everything changed, and I began to think much more about the Hemingses and to think about, how easy it was to dismiss their story. And for the reasons that I mentioned, race, I think, and class, and also law, but also, I thought, because people did not know them. They didn't know anything about them. And so what I tried to do in the Hemingses of Monticello, in a very, very long book, much longer than my first book, was to try to bring out the story, not just of Sally Hemings, but of her mother, of her sisters, and her brothers. And the difficulty of writing about enslaved women, and these particular women, is that the course of their lives were so much set by their relationships with white men, their connections to white men. Elizabeth Hemings was the daughter of, in their family story, the daughter of an English ship captain and an African woman. She was born in 1735, and we don't know, somewhere in the Williamsburg area is where she lived and where she was born. During those years, we do know that this was the high point of bringing slaves into Virginia, into that particular area. So it's possible that, in fact, she was from Africa. Madison Hemings suggests that she might be, but he nevertheless says she's a full-blooded African. So her father, their family history is, her father tries to take ownership of his daughter, but he can't do it because Virginia had accepted the rule parta sequitur ventrum, that slavery went through women, which is another thing. So you imagine, talk about law. Law makes you the transmitter of a degraded status, which in turn, obviously, not only degrades the issue of the woman, but the woman herself in the eyes. That is part of the history of African American women and people seeing African American women. So the way people see African American women. So she is a mixed race child, but her father has no right to her because her mother was a slave. She grows up in the household of John Wales, and later on, when after John Wales loses 3 of his wives, takes her as a concubine. Now these are Madison Hemings's words about his grandmother. He says he took her as a concubine, and she had 6 children with her, and the youngest was his mother, Sally Hemings. So then we have Sally Hemings later on, after they come into the ownership of Jefferson. After Martha dies, Sally Hemings becomes, and then he uses the term, becomes Mr. Jefferson's concubine, because everybody called Jefferson Mr. Jefferson, his daughter and everybody, to anyone in public, that's what they called him. He also refers to him as father throughout the recollections as well. But he becomes Mr. Jefferson's concubine, and people have wondered, what does that mean? Does he use the term, concubine? When you think of concubine, you think of like a biblical thing. Somebody's got a bunch of wives and 1,000 concubines, or Genghis Khan and his brothers and thousands of concubines. What does that actually mean? And I've gone back and forth with people about this. I mean, I think concubine means a man, a woman who lives with a guy to whom she's not married. And other people suggest, well, it has a different sense, that it suggests that she's a vessel, she's meaningless to him, concubine. I don't know. I don't understand why that's necessary, other than the sort of normal usage, biblical usage of it. I don't know what else word he would use. Mistress? Does that fit? I think people today would say, well, think of this in terms of rape. A person who can't say no, is this a connection? Is this, how am I to view this? It's not likely that he would say, and then my father raped my mother for the next 38 years. I mean, that's not what he would say either. So there's got to be some way to encompass this, and the term is a biblical term, but it's also a legal term. One of the things I do in the Hemings is I go back and I look at how was that term used in the 1870s? Where would that come up? And in legal cases, judges referred to women who lived with men without being married as concubines, white women. And then, their case, and he says, well, before they got married, he was his concubine, and now he's his wife, and now these things apply. So there's no sense that concubine has a particular, means vessel, is what people describe it as. So how do you write about someone when the sensitivities about the rape of African American women, if not are heightened, should be heightened, because this is, any situation you have, in a situation of slavery, colonialism, particularly slavery, you put men in the control of the bodies of women, that's what's going to happen. I sat down with some an archaeologist and a geneticist at the medical center at Harvard, and we were talking about some of their findings. They aren't historians. They weren't doing this for historical purposes. They had other reasons for doing this kind of genetic research, and determined and found that there were high concentrations of European Y male chromosomes in enslaved people in the Mississippi Delta, just really, really high concentrations of it. And I said, is this like, I'm bringing Genghis Khan up again, because he and his brothers had, so many people have their Y chromosomes because they had so many kids with so many different women. And they said, no, this is different people, different types. It's not just like a handful of guys who are doing this. And what he said is it looks very much like England, where you have the conquests in England, the Picts and the Celts, and when a group comes in and takes over a particular place, and the Y chromosomes of the conquerors go into the conquered and not the other way. You don't see the conquered people. The women are not they're not the ones who are, injecting their DNA into people. And he said South America, so it looks very, very much like that. So the stories that African American people are telling about their history, the stories that law can't tell because these people couldn't get married, is being told in science. In the science that they're doing now. And so it helped in this particular situation, but I think it's going to have more of an effect in the way people think about these kinds of connections and the prevalence of these kinds of connections, not only connections, but rape as well, as the years go on. So there's another way around it. Other than simply the family stories or the lack of legal connections between the people who, like Jefferson and Hemings or other enslaved people who had, connections to white men. But it's a delicate topic, and part of the reason the book is so long is that I spend lots of time trying to sort this out. Eric Foner, in his interesting review of my book in the New York Times, said I spent a lot of time trying to prove it wasn't rape. He misunderstood what I was trying to do. I was trying to make sense of a recollection of a man is talking about his parents, and he is describing something, he's describing how he and his siblings came to be free 40 years before emancipation in the United States. And he calls this man father, and he calls this woman mother, and he describes her life in a way that suggests that there was some connection that this son, recognizes. So it wasn't not me I'm trying to understand what's going on here. And the only way I could figure to do it would be to look at the stories of 3 different women. Celia, who might be known to many of you, was an enslaved woman in Missouri who killed her master after sexual abuse. He buys her, and on the way home from the auction, he rapes her. It's pretty clear that he's bought her, this young girl, for sexual purposes. And she kills him, burns him up in the fireplace, and then asks his grandson to help come. She says, I've got a lot of ashes in my fireplace. Would you help me remove them? And of course he does, and they throw him out, and he doesn't know that his granddad. And then Mary Hemings, Sally Hemings' sister, who asks to be sold to a man named Thomas Bell, and she lives with him on Main Street. She calls herself Mrs. Bell. When he died, he never frees her, but when he dies, he leaves her a property, frees the children. They take his name. The white people in the community refer to her as, and their statements like this, refer to her as his common law wife. So, and then you have Sally Hemings, whose situation is a bit more ambiguous, but you put these three women together, and I can't help but think, because I'm interested in the individual as much as I can to try to find out about the experiences of individual women, that those three women saw themselves in exactly the same way. Martha Minow, the dean of our law school, says that law school is like Sesame Street. How this thing is not like that thing. That's a big part of it. This thing is not like that thing, and to be able to distinguish situations. And while I understand the position that any sexual contact among a white man during this time period and an enslaved woman, the master, and I would say even any white man, because they had a huge amount of power. I can understand people say that that's, that should be treated the way we treat statutory rape, that it's presumptively rape. I understand that because of the power differential. But if I look at those three situations, this thing is not like that thing in me suggests that there's that these women may have experienced their lives in different ways. Somebody who gets a house, the freedom of her children. Later on, when members of her family are auctioned off, she's able to purchase some of those people. She calls herself by this name. They think of themselves in a particular way, even though there was a legal relationship that we find abhorrent. And we don't know why he didn't free her. Maybe he didn't want to live with somebody without, the only way you could live with a black woman without anybody questioning you is if you were her master. But, that's what I try to do in the book, is to try to tease those things out. And it's very, very difficult. And I know it's very, very controversial. I like to, get your thoughts about it. We did there was a conference a couple of weeks ago at Oxford, a day-long conference about consent and the very differing notions of consent in the 19th century, and not just in the context of slavery, but others. But it's a difficult one to tease out, because what do we hope to gain by having a notion of consent or not having a notion of no consent? What is this supposed to be about? But you have to talk about this because we understand that enslaved women did not have the power to say no, did not have the power to bring legal cases against people who raped them. The rape of a woman was not a rape, it was a trespass against the master, who could have a cause of action for that, of someone trespassing upon his property. So how can we talk about, and what people always ask me, love? I don't think I've been to any talk where someone does not ask me, did they love each other? As if I could have the answer to that. And you wonder why it matters. I have an idea about why it matters, but it's something people really, really want to know. And it's difficult for them to wrap their minds. It's difficult for all of us to wrap our minds around that conception, given the nature of slavery. But by the same token, the part of me thinks, these are people, and people do things that don't make any sense, or something we can't say what I would do or would not do in those particular circumstances. And then there is the issue of race. Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings is a quarter black. Her father was a white man. Her grandfathers were white men. Why would I think that she would think that the only suitable partner for her, or a father of her children, would be a black man? We've come up with a certain notion of racial solidarity that is not operating at that particular time period. So if it were going to be a white man, if you think about who she would have been with, if it were going to be a white man, why wouldn't Jefferson be as good as any other one? So there's that wrinkle in it too. Why, who would this person be with? When people tell me that it doesn't make any sense for her to be with him, I think, well, this is what you have to do. You're sitting at your desk. Well, who would she be married to? And someone said to me once, she should have waited. She should have waited to find another mixed-race person. You know, so there's that kind of tricky business as well. So there's just a lot here that you have to deal with, and a lot of complicated things because you're dealing with human beings. It's a lot to ask of people during that time period that they not do the best they can for themselves and their families. You know, what they have to do to survive, and particularly women, because women, even white women, did what they had to do to survive, and sometimes it meant marrying people that they didn't want to marry, or that their families made them marry. So the levels of some freedom that exist in this time period is, you know, there's a continuum, and of course Sally Hemings and her family were on the end of it, on the sort of most constricted end of it. But you have to think of all these things in relationship to one another. And so when I end the book, Sally Hemings is not freed in Jefferson's will. She is informally freed. Her sons take her to live in Charlottesville, and she is listed on a census as a free white woman in 1830. And then later on, they do a census after the Nat Turner revolt. They do a census and where they go and ask black people if they want to go back to Africa. And they go to Sally Hemings and her sons and family and ask them, do you want to go back to Africa? And she says no, not surprisingly. And she lives out her life as a person not that the law doesn't protect, because she's not legally freed by Martha or Jefferson, but the community, given these censuses and the way she's treated, treat her as if she's a free person. And that is the end of her story. Her sons go on to stay in Charlottesville for a time, and then later on move out to Ohio, and then one of them decides that the law is too hard on blacks, is too hard being black, and he changes his racial designation, moves to Wisconsin, and becomes Eston Jefferson. And it is the DNA from that descendant that gave us the answer that Herb referred to and that Herb gave to me back in 1998, I should say. So this is a family that existed biologically, that existed in reality, but couldn't protect itself in law during during the time of slavery, and later on was not protected, I would say, by historians who accepted the notion that they were uncovered by the law, and in turn protected Jefferson and his family because of who he was, and law gave them the capacity to turn their heads to reality. So law is important. I'm a lawyer, and I think law is important, but it also has a way of obscuring things, and it has obscured many, many stories of African American people. So with that, I'd like to take your questions. The people in Charlottesville referred to Sally Hemings. They're sort of reminiscences, and not long after these people died, recollections of life in Charlottesville, and they referred to her as common law wife. I would not refer to common law wife because she could not have been a statutory wife, and so common law implies that the people, there's stuff that goes with that. There would be, if somebody's deemed a common law wife, there would be, property, could vest, there are reasons, there are consequences to that. So I wouldn't use that term. Concubine just sounds biblical. I don't really know what, as I said, I looked at the term in the 1870s when Madison Hemings did, that's a great one, the wonderful thing about the Google, and actually you could look at this stuff, and there are mainly legal cases that are looking at situations where a couple gets married, and then he may have promised her something before they got married, and then they get married afterwards. And the judge has no problem, judges have no problem in between going back and forth between concubine and wife. So if the person can rise to the status of a wife, it suggests that it's not, concubine is not the thing that people were saying before, that it equates meaningless vessel that I'm using, unless your wife is the meaningless vessel you're using. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm saying, but what I was saying, that it's interesting that historians would go along with that. It's so clearly a racket. I mean, you know that, no, but to tell people that if you're married, unless you're married, you get no protection at all. We can have sex with, you know, African-American women, enslaved women. They have no recourse. They can't go to court, you know, they aren't married women. There's nothing you could do about that. Why would historians look at that situation and not break through the law, you know, look beyond the law? Why would they stand on law as the answer when it's pretty clear that law, you know, I say in the Hemings is in this time is a racket to protect white men from their depredations against African-American women?
So maybe the historians are also protecting themselves.
Well, yeah, I think, well, Herb, cover your ears, Herb. No, I mean, Herb, you don't understand. I mean, you know, a lot of the people who were writing about Jefferson were, in this time period, were Southern white guys who basically were sort of saying, Jefferson wouldn't do anything that I wouldn't do. And Jefferson, or that I would not admit doing. I mean, that's somebody said they wouldn't do. Jefferson wouldn't do anything that I wouldn't do. And I think it came at a particular time. I think, they were doing it to protect them, their image of Jefferson, but to the extent that their image of Jefferson was tied up in their own self-image, that's important too. So it's like I gave them a girlfriend they didn't want, you know, or somebody that they didn't, you know, it's like now I have to
want to acknowledge.
Yeah, now that I have to deal with this particular person. I have to put myself into the mind of Jefferson, but I have to put myself into the mind of a person who spent 38 years having sex with a woman who wasn't white. And that was not a place they want to be. And I think it's still difficult for people to understand that, you know, white men in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, we'll say 18th and 19th century in particular, were used to sleeping with African-American women to an extent that 20th century and 21st century white men are not. They are assuming that their understanding, and they're assuming that because the law is against it. You know, the law says thou shalt not do this. But that doesn't mean that people aren't doing it. That means you don't want people to do it. But I think the DNA, the stories of African American people are saying pretty clearly that this was not an exotic or crazy thing, but I think it appeared as an exotic or a crazy thing to the historians who were writing Jefferson's life. So this is a long answer to your question, but just say, yes, it was a protection racket at the time, and the people who were looking at this were furthering it in history by pretending that all these rules, that you could look at this situation and think that it made any sense. That you have this amount of power that these people have over the other individuals, and you could assume, you could construct them as innocent. You can construct people who are engaging in this level of oppression as innocent folks and not look behind the law and look behind their explanations. Yes, I've heard of that. I've heard of it. I've not been to any of the meetings. I haven't been to any of the meetings. I haven't been to the Monticello Association and those things either. But yes, I am aware of that. Sally Hemings was the daughter of a man named John Wales. John Wales was also the father of Jefferson's wife. So Sally Hemings and Jefferson's wife were half-sisters. So when Jefferson's father-in-law dies, Sally Hemings and her siblings come to Monticello. She comes to Monticello as a 3-year-old. And she's the youngest of the Hemings-Wales children. So he inherits her from his father-in-law, the couple. And so, yeah, and so when Martha dies in 1782, she's a little girl. She's 9, and she's in Eppington with his daughter. Jefferson goes to France. And some years later, Sally Hemings goes to France when she's 14 years old. So no, he doesn't buy her. He inherits her as a little girl.
So his wife, Jefferson's wife, actually dies before she becomes an older woman. Sally.
Yeah, she dies when Sally is 9 years old.
So he is really, at that point, he's an unmarried man.
Yeah, he's
not
an unmarried
married
man.
At all.
Yeah, he's married man.
He never marries again. He just stays with Sally.
He never marries again. No.
Okay.
No. Yeah, well, slave women, because of parta sequitur ventrum, the increase of children belonged to the master. And there's a whole debate in historiography, in the historical profession, about breeding, about slave breeding, whether people had, slave breeding plantations and so forth. But, people reproduced. I don't understand why it would have to be done, simply because, people have children, and the way the law was set up, that naturally is an increase. I don't think you have to encourage people to have sex, is what I'm getting at. And the thinking, I know abolitionists said that, what are you laughing about? It wasn't my daughter down here. It was a natural function of, that's why they changed the law. The law, Englishmen came over with the rule, you were what your father was. And so you change it to you are what your mother is, and I think the consequences just flow from that it's a natural thing. What people do is normal. If they have children, those children belong to masters. And because of the different climate, the different type of work than they had in the West Indies and Brazil, where they were doing cane production, which is death, essentially, they were able to, and for other reasons, to have a natural increase in the population. I don't think it was because, it's certainly in Monticello, Jefferson was an absentee owner person. Jefferson was in public life. He had one real obsession, and that was the United States. I mean, he had many obsessions, little obsessions, but the big obsession was, he was not going around saying, Sally and, or, Sue and John, y'all get together. That's not what he was doing. That's not his issue. But definitely, once you make it parta sequitur ventrum, make the women responsible for transmitting slavery, you increase wealth, and, and that's what, and they not only work, but they actually produce more slaves. Well, the person who used the word, I've neglected the chronology here, was Madison Hemings, who was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And he says, my grandmother, he took my grandmother as a concubine. He's talking about John Wales. Then when he talks about his father, he says, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine. So this is a son and a grandson talking about his mother and grandmother. And I did look at it's interesting, in other slave societies, Jamaica, in the French system, historians people have less of a problem with suggesting that there were different types of relationships. In the United States, nobody thinks that anybody actually had an affective connection. But people in Jamaica, other places, don't seem to have that problem. They say, yeah, sometimes, yeah, and he, really liked this woman and blah, 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 and that's what they did. But we have difficulty. It's more problematic for us. For whatever reason. For whatever reason, I know, because I don't want to say we're not more conscious than other people, but African American people are very much, I don't know, I should stop. No, I mean, it is. I've wondered about that, the ease with which other communities can recognize that, sure, there must have been somebody in 300 years, a man and a woman who actually liked each other. There must have been. But the part of the problem, here's the problem. Okay, I'm thinking out loud here. Here's the problem. We know how it's going to be used, right? It's going to be, because everything done in America is going to be done and done to death. They're going to be, it was love and, it was this grand romance and wasn't it wonderful? And so you don't want that, because anything you say that suggests that this was not, 24 hours, unremitting hell, that all the time, that nobody ever smiled, nothing ever happened, that people out there who want to minimize the horror of slavery are going to say, see, it wasn't so bad. So when I think it's the political, everything you say, everything I'm saying up here, everything you do is very, very political, because we're still fighting this battle. There are people out there, there is the Supreme Court, they had an oral argument yesterday about the Confederate flag on the Texas license plates. And you're just thinking, I know probably what's going to happen with that, but just think, here's a flag that flew against the United States of America. And we're still holding on to this stuff. Some people are still, saying it's not about that, it's about heritage, but, and so it's a heritage. It is lots of heritage. So it's so political. And it was Jefferson, too, because if you say, Jefferson, because his symbol means so much, and people have been fighting over him about lots of different things, but of course this is incredibly fraught territory, because if you say, she's a concubine, well, his friend, one of his best friends, described her as a substitute for a wife. And he says that lots of this was a man who was a co-founder of the University of Virginia. In his diary, he said that lots of bachelor and widowed slave owners would take an enslaved woman as a substitute for a wife, which suggests to me there's something different than someone, marauding through the slave quarters. That this was, and as in colonial societies, people go places and this is his woman, that's what people would understand. But we have difficulty with it because I think we are we're still fighting these political values. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I think because I'm fighting it too, I'm all down off in there myself. But it's hard because every single thing, that there's somebody out there who's going to say, see, it was not so bad as everybody says. I think there are people, lots of us can have intellectual beliefs that we don't live up to in our own lives emotionally. Jefferson, he tells a story. This first memory is of being handed up on a pillow, by a slave, to a slave on horseback. The slave is on horseback, and somebody's giving him to be carried a particular place. And when he dies, his grandson says that he says something, and the only person in the room who understands what he says is a man named Burl Colbert, who's Sally Hemings' nephew. And he's Jefferson's last manservant. And Burl Colbert knows that he wants to be lifted up on his pillows, higher up on his pillow. So Burl does what he says, and then Jefferson closes his eyes and then never wakes up. So the first person he saw and the last person he saw was an African-American enslaved person. The whole institution bounded his life. The people who are freeing slaves during Jefferson's time are, in the main, almost to a person, religious people, doing it out of religious. There are Quakers, there are Methodists. John Wesley was not only, anti-slavery, but for his time was sort of as much as an anti-racist you could be at that time period. These are the people who are doing it. They're people who are under the influence of religion who are the ones who are freeing slaves. And Jefferson was not. I mean, religion can make you, as we well know, do things that appear irrational in a good way, that is freeing slaves, getting rid of all your property, and irrational in bad ways, too. But he was not under the influence of religion in that fashion. And so he doesn't free his slaves. So I firmly believe Jefferson thought that slavery was wrong because Jefferson believed in a particular view of the Enlightenment. He thought that everything was going to get better. He believed that people were essentially good, and it was just a question over time with education, everything is going to get better and better and better. Of course, we know that's not true. And that's what he sincerely believed that. But he did not, as you say, have the will to do this on his own for himself. And I think the lack of the spur is because Jefferson was, ethics and the Enlightenment philosophy is not the same as religious fervor. It was religious fervor that drove, lots of people, most people that I know of, or belief, or do it on religious reasons for getting rid of freeing their own slaves. The other thing, at some point, Jefferson was in debt, as Herb well knows, for most of his adult life. And by the end of his life was $107,000 in debt, at least that's the phrase that's given, which means that, slaves are assets in the hands of the executive. He couldn't, if you freed slaves, your debtors could say, your creditors could say, excuse me, come back, you are a property. So what he ended up having to do, it must have been to talk to his creditors to free the 5 people that he freed at the end of his life. So religious people, George Washington arranged to have slaves freed upon Martha's death, his wife's death, after his death, but George Washington had no children of his body, as they say in the law, and his stepchildren were part of a fabulously wealthy family. The Custis family had lots of money. So there's a difference between freeing your slaves when you don't have, it'd be interesting to see if there had been a George Washington Jr., what would have happened? But there was. So Jefferson had a daughter, a legal daughter who could have inherited from him if he had had anything to inherit to leave, but he didn't. So yeah, so it's long answer, but I think intellectually he believed that because he believed that slavery was backward and that this was something that was, eventually people would get rid of that. Like we say now, think of something that we know now that we think one day they're not going to do that anymore because blah, 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 blah. They would have learned better. But he didn't have the will to do it on his own. Well, I'm interested in it in a general way, but not in enough to write about it. No, I'm seriously, my research life is pretty much set, from now on. But it is fascinating to pull that kind of stuff together because, as I was saying before, this kind of thing is more prevalent than people wanted to admit because it really does go to the question of who we are as Americans. It's very difficult for people, to see Jefferson as a founder, as a white man, as a founder, who actually has non-white children. It changes the sort of story of America's beginnings. It was always and has always been, that dread word, a multicultural society in a way. Certainly not in the sort of nice, wonderful way that we describe it, but it was never a white country. And that has to be made clear. on that point, I mean, I think what, you're saying makes sense, although I will say, one of the real dilemmas of slavery for people who are thinking about taking their freedom, because James, she's right, James and Sally Hemings could have taken their freedom in France, is, you've got a family back there, and back in the United States. And being free without your family is tough. And I think women in particular are, have been raised to think about family and responsibilities to family. So I'm not saying that she would not want to come back with him just because, she could have thought he was a great guy. I mean, her brother says, after he's freed, says, I would rather work for Jefferson than any man alive. That's, her brother James says that. Her brother Robert sends him presents. I mean, so if her brothers could like him, I don't think that there would be an issue about her necessarily. It's just, it's tough for us because we understand it's back to the power differential there. How do you sort all of this stuff out? And we can't because we don't, I mean, Madison Hemings' family talks about the descendants, talk about this, they talk about how Jefferson feels about Sally Hemings, that he loved her. They don't talk about how she felt about him. So, it's really, but it's almost back to the Martha parallel in the sense we have Jefferson, we have somebody talking about, how Jefferson feels, but we don't actually have Martha, we don't actually have Sally Hemings's feelings about it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so about him not freeing her formally. She's 54 years old at the time that, wait a minute, am I getting this right? Yeah, when he dies, 53 years old. If you freed anybody above the age of 45 in Virginia, you had to say how you were going to take care of that person for the rest of their lives. So here's what he would have had to do first. The first thing is that if you freed the person, you had to petition the legislature to allow them to remain in the state. So that's one thing. So then he'd have to say, legislators, please let Sally Hemings stay in the state. And they could say yes or no. Then he had to say, and because she's over 45, I have to say how I'm going to take care of her for the rest of her lives. I don't think, I mean, I know for a fact, I don't believe that, I can't imagine any circumstance under which he would do that. And I don't think he would have thought, and this is the part that comes to his Jefferson's real issue is with women. Well, he has lots of issues, but with women, I don't think he would have thought it made sense to free a woman in her 50s. I don't think he would have, wouldn't think that that was a proper thing to do. He never freed, the only woman he ever freed was his daughter Harriet. And he frees her informally. Harriet and Beverly is a male. They leave Monticello to live as white people. So they don't want freedom papers, because if you got freedom papers, then people know that you weren't free, and no, you're not white. So they go off as white people. And he frees Harriet because he has to free her, let her go, because if she has a baby, the baby is enslaved. And technically, in Virginia, the children she had when she's, with her husband, whom she marries, the white man she marries, would be enslaved. But women, he did not free any other women. And I don't think he would think that freeing a woman was a thing to do, particularly not an older woman, but definitely not having to put her name in a document. I mean, the most important person in Jefferson's life was Martha Randolph, was his daughter. Martha Randolph. I don't think there's any question about that. And to humiliate her, which it would have been, this is just me, this is my speculation, but I think this would have been, this would have been humiliation to her. And she was the most important person in his life, and he was not going to do that.